Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election and Election Watch series. Please join me in welcoming today's guest, Stacey Morris, Head of Energy Research at Vetify. Stacey, thanks for joining us for the show. It's good to have you here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Anthony. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Listen, we wanted you here because, listen, on everyone's minds as they're going to the polls this November, certainly the economy is a giant aspect of what people think about when they're going to vote. Policy, of course, but really at the end of the day, it's what's happening with people's wallets. And one of those areas that people are concerned about are the energy markets, whether it's the gas you're putting in your car or some of the climate initiatives that President Biden has put into place since he's been in office. So just broadly, before we get into the specifics here, when it comes to energy and sort of the energy space, how much is that impacted by elections in general and this one coming up?
Well, I think sometimes there's a lot of hype around elections in the energy space and the potential impact. But overall, it seems like there's not maybe as big of an impact as people would think. There are certain things that aren't really impacted by the election or who's sitting in the White House. Things like US energy production, for example, aren't really going to be impacted in the near term or medium term by who wins in November. So things like that aren't really impacted. Usually, what we see is headline risk around executive orders. But even then, there can be a difference between kind of what's said on the campaign trail or what's put in an executive order and then what actually comes to fruition. So, for example, leading up to the 2020 election, there was a lot of focus on drilling on federal lands, and President Biden came into office and put in a ban on new permits for federal drilling or drilling on federal lands. But the industry kind of knew that was coming, and so they had stockpiled permits in advance of that, and then things ended up in the courts, and ultimately, it didn't end up being that big of a deal. So certainly elections matter, and I'm not trying to say that it's not impactful for the energy space, or certainly there can be impacts for clean energy as well. But generally for oil and gas and that kind of traditional energy landscape, there may not be as much of an impact as people would think.
Right. So, something interesting that I wanted to ask you about was that President Biden and his administration paused liquefied natural gas export permits earlier this year. Do you think that that's going to have any impact as people go to the voting booths, or maybe at the very least, what the two candidates will be talking about while they're debating or on the campaign trail?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll get to the debate stage or not. I mean, I think, if you're a voter who is voting based on environmental concerns, then, that's probably something that the Biden administration scored some points on, right? The timing of announcing this LNG export permit pause in January is, I think, certainly politically convenient if you're trying to appeal to environmentally conscious voters. So I think from that standpoint, it's helpful to those who are worried about the environment. We've seen a little more focus on LNG export projects and their environmental impacts, and essentially, the pause is to kind of renew analysis on the economic impacts of LNG exports and the environmental impacts. So I think to me, it's probably going to get resolved after the election either way. But in the interim, if you're an environmentally conscious voter, it's probably something that you are happy to see.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And that's something that I think a lot of people are keeping in mind when it comes to how they're going to place their votes. Here's something else I want to ask you, because the Inflation Reduction Act has been in place now for a while. It's already spurred hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in things like manufacturing here in the U.S., largely for clean energy industries like electronic vehicles, battery plants, solar wind production. Is this at stake at all in this election, the IRA?
So I don't think so. I think even in the extreme, if you have a Republican sweep, I don't think we're going to see a wholesale repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, there might be some watering down if there is, a Republican in the White House, or Republicans are controlling Congress. But I don't think you're going to see a wholesale repeal because so much of this money that you talked about is going to red states. So it's probably not going to be politically desirable to do a full repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, broadly, I think there's a perception that if we see victories for Democrats, that's good for clean energy stocks. If we see victories for Republicans, that's good for oil and gas stocks. And I think, there's an element of that that probably has some truth to it, but it's still maybe kind of overstating the overall impact.
Right. Yeah, interesting. You mentioned how a lot of the red states, or many of the red states, were benefactors. You even have a couple of swing states in there, like Michigan, Arizona, and Georgia, that have been pretty big benefactors of the IRA. So it seems like it would sort of be in everybody's best interest to kind of not touch it, or at least keep it sort of in the similar form that it's in. So here's, I mean, maybe this is the big question, and you did touch on this in the beginning of our conversation, Stacey. Is the outcome of the election likely to impact production, specifically U.S. energy production?
Really, no. So when you think about US energy production and what drives it, it's really determined by management teams and what they're trying to accomplish and how they're responding to supply demand drivers or commodity prices ultimately. So even in 2022, when we saw oil prices spike following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, publicly traded exploration and production companies, those oil and gas producers, really didn't go crazy in terms of growing production. They kept things very measured, even though the White House was asking for more production. So at the end of the day, producers in the U.S. and publicly traded producers specifically are really accountable to shareholders, and shareholders have said they don't want to see that much production growth. So generally speaking, whoever is sitting in the White House is really not going to have much of a tangible impact on U.S. oil or gas production in the near term or the medium term. Maybe in the long term, if there's some policy around federal leases and things like that, auctions for the Gulf of Mexico. But even then, there's a long way from auctioning off some land in the Gulf of Mexico to actually bringing it to production, and it's not a near-term impact.
Right.
So overall, probably not much of an impact.
Yeah, and the U.S. is on track to break another record this year on oil and gas output. So we're currently at number one, and probably going to be further into that number one spot as we go further into the year. So it seems like where you're going is right. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot that can be done to change that, or that each candidate might not want to change that, considering that both candidates have almost equally talked about U.S. energy independence. So it seems to be a really key part of their messaging.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone loves to talk about US energy independence. It's a great story. The US has been energy independent since 2019 from the standpoint of exporting more than we import. And so it's a really good story. And even though, politicians have no real impact on production, they're going to be quick to take credit when things go right. And so I think that's why you see a lot of emphasis on energy independence and that sort of thing. Credit really goes to the industry, but politicians like to talk about it and try to take credit.
Yeah, that's sort of stating the obvious right there. I think everybody watching this understands how sort of that side of the game works. But thanks for that, Stacey. So as we're kind of leaving our audience here, just give us your maybe broader thoughts on elections and the overall impact to the oil and gas landscape.
Sure. So I think at a high level, like I mentioned, you can see some headline risk related to executive orders. And that is certainly something that bears watching. But at the end of the day, the system of checks and balances actually works pretty well here. And in my experience, there tends to be a lot of hype and concern and fuss leading up to the election. But what we usually see play out is kind of the status quo. If something is overly friendly to the oil and gas industry, it's probably going to get shot down in the courts. If it's overly punitive to the oil and gas industry, it's probably going to get shot down in the courts. So all that to say, I wouldn't worry too much about the election if you're an oil and gas investor. I wouldn't get too focused on things that become talking points or buzzy sound bites, because at the end of the day, what we tend to see is things kind of even out, and even things like grandfather clauses can help kind of maintain the status quo, even when we see new policies. So overall, I wouldn't get too concerned about it heading into November.
I think you're definitely putting a lot of minds at ease, including myself. So thank you, Stacey. Appreciate you doing that. Stacey Morris from Vetify. Good to see you, Stacey.
Thanks so much, Anthony.
Anytime. See you soon. And thank you all for joining us. For more information, please visit our website, ubs.com/election watch. There are other episodes in this series that are there for you to view, plus a lot of other election-related content coming out of our Chief Investment Office here at UBS. And we encourage you to continue this conversation with your financial advisor, so make sure you're reaching out to them. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you soon.